Dr. Vinson. Please go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I didn't realize Curtis was going to be introducing me, so that was a treat. And he is, I mean, you all know what a treasure you have in him. He's been great for me on the board, coming onto it and being involved with it. So thank you so much, Dr. Adams. And it doesn't look like I can share my screen yet. So if I can get that permission, I'll share my slides with you.
Yep, hang on one second.
No problem. Gotta have at least one thing like this happen, you know, in 2020-ish that we're in now.
All right, you should be able to, you should be able to go and present. Let me know if you can't.
It's still grayed out for me. I will, let me pop out and back in.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
good.
It looked like maybe Sarah Sweeney was made the presenter rather than Sarah Vinson.
I think she just joined, so hang on one second. There she goes. I think you're good now. We can see it.
I think you're muted, Sarah.
Dr. Vinson, you may have to stop sharing in order to unmute. Do you see the unmute icon?
I think we're good.
Okay, you got
Are we
it.
good now?
Yes.
All right. So talking about social injustice and mental health, as was mentioned, I work at Morehouse School of Medicine, and I've always been part-time there. So I also have a foot in the private practice space and the forensic space, which certainly informs this talk and my work as a psychiatrist more broadly. And also, I must acknowledge my co-editor for the Social Injustice and Mental Health book, Dr. Ruth Shim, who was also the co-editor of Social Determinants of Health. So what's ahead? We will have an introduction, talk about mental health care from a social justice informed lens, child trauma, the carceral system, substance use disorders, advocacy, a call to action, and then hopefully have a really robust discussion about some of the things that are brought up during the course of the talk. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the verbiage, the carceral system is another name for the criminal justice system. So often in medicine, because we are more oriented toward illness and toward deficits, we think about mental illness more so than we think about mental health. And for this talk, I wanted to just start with a definition of health, because our goal as mental health providers, as mental health advocates, as people who understand the value of mental health is not just the absence of symptoms or that the Prozac or the Haldol works, but you really want people to be in a mentally healthy place. And so one definition that I like for that is from the World Health Organization. It says mental health is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So as we're going through the different elements of this talk, the different things that are brought up, I ask you to have this as a sort of reference point for you throughout, and think about how the different groups that I'm discussing may or may not be able to achieve this based on some of the realities of the current configuration of our society. So defining social justice, and there are many different definitions of this, but again, I think it's helpful just to have one to help us level set of sorts before we begin. So this is one from John Rawls, which is assuring the protection of equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, as well as taking care of the least advantaged members of society. And so, social justice is one of those things that's become a bit of a buzzword. You have all sorts of connotations with it, and the social justice warrior, so to speak. But fundamentally, this is what we're talking about when we use that term. So I also have to acknowledge, at the beginning of this talk, this is a grand rounds in a division in a medical school, that we are far from at a consensus within medicine about where this should publicized and somewhat controversial editorial, Take Two Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns. And I don't put this up here to single out this person, but I think that this is representative of a lot of the thought process in medicine. And he was really bemoaning the fact that social justice was making its way into curricula, that it was making its way into discussions. And a quotation from it was, "Curricula will increasingly focus on climate change, social inequities, gun violence, bias, and other progressive causes only tangentially related to treating illness, and so will many of our doctors in coming years." So he really saw this as something that was drawing away from things that were essential or important in the medical education process. And he asked, why have medical schools become a target for inculcating social policy when the stated purpose of medical education since Hippocrates has been to develop individuals who know how to cure patients? And a counter to that is that part of this process of addressing illness, of curing, of helping people requires that you take a bigger lens than what we learn in microbiology and anatomy and pathology. And so one of the responses to that was that social and health policies have always determined who gets sick and who gets care, and where and how. Understanding the social drivers of health and illness is not peripheral or tangential to health. It is the key to diagnosing and meeting a patient's fundamental needs. So there are different camps within medicine, and I think that we're going to have to do some figuring out as a profession about where we stand. You can probably guess based on my talk in the book that where I do, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll see where this does have a role in our work. So James Baldwin said, "Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." Whether you think of yourself as a social justice warrior or not, or think of this as something that is key to your work as a physician, the undeniable reality is that as a physician, as a privileged member of society, as someone who's in the field where you can give people diagnoses that can have significant implications for their lives outside of the clinic, you absolutely do have power. And so ignorance related to issues that are essential to your patients' inner experiences to their place in the world, to the way that the world responds to them, is a justice issue. And so I encourage you to think about that power you have, and also think about ways that you may not be aware of some of the things that are really critical to your patient's experiences, and the way that medical teaching and training as it's currently configured doesn't help us with this knowledge gap or this ignorance. So the American dream is one that I think many of us take for granted to a certain degree, maybe less so given some of the recent events, but it bears acknowledging that for most of us who have the privilege of going to college, going to graduate school, going to medical school, delaying the start of your career, accumulating all that student loan debt, not all, but certainly the group of people who get to become physicians are a privileged group relative to the American population as a whole. And for those who didn't start off in a privileged group and were able to be in the position that you all are in, to be part of this department and part of listening to this talk today, you're people for whom, to a large degree, the system worked, that going to school, getting your education, working hard, resulted in upward mobility and a change in your circumstance. We have to be aware that that is not the case for everyone, and that you have this narrative that this is possible to all in our society, but the data actually doesn't back that up. And so we have to be mindful of how our lived experiences don't necessarily mirror those of the people that we serve or of the population more broadly. So in thinking about that, this brings us to health disparities. And disparities, of course, aren't restricted to health, but of course that's our focus today. But when we talk about disparities, we're really landing on differences in health status among distinct segments of the population, including differences that occur by gender, race, or ethnicity, education, disability, or living in various geographic localities. When you use the word inequities, there's an acknowledgement that it's not just a difference, but that this difference is the result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. So with disparities, in using that verbiage, there's almost this, golly gee, I don't know where that came from, vibe that goes with that. But with health inequities, you are pointing out that this is because of choices that we have made as a society and because of the way that we are constructed through our policies and our practices. So this is a diagram from Dr. Shim and Dr. Compton in the Social Justice and Social Injustice and Mental Health book. And we have all received some training about social determinants of health, thinking about where people live, work, learn, and play, how that plays into how they present to you and their stressors and the options they have for dealing with their stressors. So things like homelessness and housing instability, food insecurity, the built environment, educational opportunities, upward mobility economically or lack thereof, exposure to violence, adverse early experiences, and things like that. And so we were thinking of this as, more upstream to them being diagnosed with mental health problems within developing a mental health issue. But if we think about sort of what is determining those social determinants or what is driving those social determinants, we find ourselves looking at policy and social norms. And that's really the focus of social justice efforts, is wanting to change policies in a way that makes that distribution of opportunity more fair and more just than it currently is. And we understand that there has to be this interplay between policy and social norms, right? So you can have a policy, but if there still isn't the public will behind it, it won't be enacted fully. And we have certainly seen that as an example with parity in mental health, that we're still working to get there, even though we have policies on the books. And so it's not enough for us to think about social determinants. We have to think about how to actually change them if we want to move toward a healthier society. And it's interesting. So Daniel Dawes, who's also at Morehouse School of Medicine, he's the head of the Sexual Health Leadership Institute here, wrote a book, The Political Determinants of Health, that came out probably 4 or 5 months before our social justice and mental health talk. And you would think that we were like colluding and working together, but we weren't, but we saw the same thing, right? That the discussion about social determinants also needs to be a discussion about how we change the way that we operate so that we can affect those determinants in a way that leads to better health outcomes, or at least that stops hurting people. One of the things that's important to think through when we're talking about systems change and social justice and policies is how different this looks. And so with inequality, you have one person who has unequal access to opportunities because of sort of what is being given to them, or the way that the tree in this case, as the example, is configured. With equality, you're saying, well, if this person has a ladder, we're going to give this person the ladder. But without accounting for the differences in that person's situation, it still doesn't result in the same access. So you evenly distribute tools and assistance, but the access isn't the same. With equity, you are looking at custom tools that identify and address that inequality. So you're saying, okay, well, this task we're asking this person to do, it's harder because of where they stand in the society. So we're going to give them more tools to do it. And that is equity. Whereas with justice, we're really shifting toward thinking about how do we fix the system so that we have equal access to both tools and to opportunities. So some principles of social justice. And again, I ask you to think about this in the context of medical training, things that you were taught as you were going through, or things that you've heard discussed in medical settings, and how these things sort of rear their head, and how this could tie into this issue of justice or equity or equality. Essentialism, this is the belief that there are distinct, unchanging, and natural characteristics that define social groups and facilitate their categorization. Biological determinism, the false belief that racial groups are biologically and genetically different. Erasure of context, failure to consider socio-historical context when seeking to understand the etiology of inequities. And structural racism, a system in which policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. So I'll give you an example of one that you hear in medicine a lot with erasure of context. And it's really erasure of context and essentialism, but you'll hear people talk about cultural mistrust of minority communities or cultural mistrust of Black communities as it relates to healthcare, right? So it's putting the characteristic on the group and saying, this is something that Black people do. And it's also not looking at it in the context of how they are treated in the society. And it drives me crazy that people often will refer to Tuskegee as if that was the last time that the healthcare system was racist against Black people, or the last time that racism was experienced by this community within the healthcare system. And so it's really more a matter of the fact that our system quite reliably, consistently, and demonstrably has different outcomes and different treatment and different engagement and overdiagnosis of certain more stigmatizing illnesses with Black people that has led to a mistrust. And so it's not just that the people are naturally a mistrusting group of folks, it's that the system has not proven itself trustworthy to this group of folks. But rather than looking at that in context, it is something that's just attributed to them. And so there are types of oppression that can come out of those ways of thinking. And there are ways that oppression can be justified or rationalized because of those ways of thinking. So some examples are exploitation, the unequal exchange of one group's labor and energies for another group's advantage and advancement. cultural imperialism, which is when the establishing ruling class culture is the norm, and there's an othering of groups that are not part of the dominant culture. And we see this all the time, right? Where there are, cultural competency modules, and they talk about everybody, but they don't talk about white people because they're, the norm and they're the unwritten sort of standard, even though there are definitely elements of white culture that are important for us to think about and understand. But this is one of those results of cultural imperialism that we don't think that we need to examine that group. Powerlessness, oppressed groups lack power and are blocked from routes to gaining power. Marginalization, expelling specific groups from meaningful participation in society, and then violence when there are threats and experiences of physical and structural violence. And some of these may, apply more to your patients or the people you're serving, but there are also things that we see happen within our medical community, within our academic circles as well. So things like powerlessness and marginalization and exploitation certainly are experienced by groups that are in disempowered groups in academic settings as well. So in thinking about the mental health care system, and the authors for our mental health care chapter of social injustice and mental health led with saying that the system is really a misnomer because it doesn't help people get healthy or consistently provide care, and it's a really disjointed system that maybe shouldn't get to be called a system. And I think there's some truth to that. And part of what we walk through is sort of how our system is constructed, right? And so we know that we don't reach a lot of the people who need help. We know that we have a lot of inequities in terms of outcomes and access. But this is a result of our design. And so hospitals, we see here that inequities are the result of a confluence of residential segregation, hospital imperatives to generate revenue, and state policy making. And there are ways that interacts with other issues that we're aware of in society as well. So even something like Medicaid and whether psychiatrists accept it, you see, even when communities have comparable rates of patients with Medicaid, that race plays into that as well. So a predominantly white community that has a lot of people with Medicaid is more likely to have providers than a predominantly Black community that has a lot of people with Medicaid. So it's not just about reimbursement rates and Medicaid spending and that sort of thing, but it interacts with these other issues. For physicians, this gets to that opportunity issue. Prior to the Flexner report, there were a lot of medical schools that served Black and female medical students. With that report's standardization of medical training and the requirement from some technical things that were needed, that would be more expensive and maybe prohibitively so for some of these smaller schools. Most of them closed, and so you only had a couple of Black medical schools survive, and so by cutting off those schools and leaving those remaining segregated schools, it really cut off medical training for a whole segment of the population, or for multiple segments of the population. So we saw segregation in medical schools, and later anti-affirmative action policies that underrepresented minority medical students and physicians. And then health insurance coverage. So we know that we still don't have universal health insurance in this country. If you look at the history of it, there were ways that it was tied to concerns about providing care for Black people, particularly in the South, by Southern legislators that made that difficult. We have seen in these past 4 years that even after the passage of a law that was intended to expand access, there have been consistent efforts to undermine that law and to decrease its impact. So if you'd like to read more, if you haven't yet, there's a 1619 Project episode 4, specifically how the bad book started, that gets more into this issue. And so when I say the system, is inequitable and it doesn't work, and there's structural racism there, that is something that, again, I recognize that not everyone is on board with. To the degree that I think I can say this. I'm in the process of submitting an article, and one of the peer reviewers said as his response that it sounded as if I was saying there's racism in mental health care, as if that wasn't something I was intending to say. And I was like, yeah, that's the point of what I'm saying here. That's not an error or a typo. And so this person who was chosen to peer review a paper about access and social justice doubted whether that was a statement that could be made. When you have data like this, right, that 69% of Black adults with any mental illness receive no treatment, that 42% of Black adults with serious mental illness receive no treatment, that 67% of Latinx adults with any mental illness receive no treatment, and that 44% of Latinx adults with serious mental illness receive no treatment. So we have information that shows that the system is not serving these folks as well as it serves others. And when you look at substance use disorders, those numbers are even worse, with 89% of Latinx adults with substance use disorder receiving no treatment and 88% of those of Black adults. And so there are all these reasons, right, that have to do with it. So if you go to these cultural competency seminars, they say, well, Latinx people are distrusting of institutions and so are Black people, and that's why they don't get care. And now, yeah, there's that stigma too. So there's this focus on the group, sort of laying the blame at their feet, but there are very real barriers that are part of how our system works or doesn't work that make that difficult. And yes, these barriers are present for people across the board, but because of income inequality, wealth inequality, they're going to have a disproportionate impact on groups from those populations. And so things like caps on coverage, benefit limits, lower reimbursement rates for providers leads to people being particular and selective about where they practice and sometimes not practicing in these communities. But you also have the fact that many in our field will opt out of private or public insurance networks. And we have out-of-network providers 3.6 to 5.8 times higher than other medical specialties. Now, I don't think that's just because psychiatrists are greedy and don't want to serve people. I think there's a part of this, at least, that is driven by the fact that the system as it's constructed sort of devalues mental health as well. So when you ask people, like actually ask Black people why they don't get treatment, not necessarily the people who are doing your cultural competency seminars, when you ask the population, they say cost is the most commonly cited reason for not seeking care. And this is twice as often as minimization of symptoms and nearly 5 times as often as stigma. So the next time you're in a class and they are focusing on stigma and not addressing the barriers and costs and how that plays into things, think about that critically. Moving into substance use disorders. So with substance use disorders, there's certainly an interplay of societal narratives, media coverage, the group that's affected by a given epidemic, and how the issue is responded to. So with substance use disorders, more so than with other mental health issues, you have this moral panic that can occur. And with moral panic, you have someone or something that is perceived or defined as a threat to social norms. News media and communities depict the threat in symbolic ways. There's widespread public concern that's aroused by these portrayals. Authorities and policymakers respond to the threat with new laws or policies, and these actions lead to social change for better or worse in the community. So this is a publicized sentencing disparity between crack and cocaine, and one of the most striking examples of how the group of people associated with a substance, more so than the biology or the science, decides how society responds to it. And certainly we saw that when the group was a group of people that were already presumed to be violent, that were already marginalized, that weren't going to receive the same empathy from lawmakers in the same way, there was a very punitive response. There was a very judgmental response of people who were trying to deal with this disorder and that there was a shifting, that fundamental clinical accountability of drug treatment professionals to individual patients have been subordinated to the goals of the criminal justice system, and that's Ernest Drucker and Upper Lake prisons. So if you look at how crack kids, crack mothers, crack babies, like all of that discussion and how they were treated and talked about, and how those mothers were discussed, and compare that with mothers during the opioid epidemic. So rather than painting them as these evil, callous folks who don't care about their children, there's this coverage about how these mothers addicted to drugs struggle to get off of them in the midst of the crisis. And there's these sympathetic pictures of the child and their nice clothes. And this has policy implications and treatment implications as well, but also just from an advocacy perspective, it can come into play. And I'll give you guys an example. I'm an advisor for a national addiction council, and one of the things that I commented on their page, they have all these testimonies or testimonials of people who have loved ones who have struggled with opioid addiction or have lost loved ones to opioid addiction. And I made a comment about the fact that the page was really, really, really white. And what the executive director said to me was that when they've had testimonials from Black or brown people, the comments they receive on their site include a lot of judgment, some name calling, a lot of moralizing. And so even the response in the comment thread on that website very clearly was racialized, even though they're talking about the same exact drug. And you could see where this could have implications for policy and where resources are allocated, right? Even if we look at our APA, American Psychiatric Association, addiction page, you would not know that people were still dying from cocaine. You would not know that people in rural America are still dealing with meth. It is very focused on opioids. And it's not that those other drugs aren't substance use disorders as well, is that the population affected by the opioid epidemic, or one of the major populations affected, is one that society values and thinks is important. So you are preferentially training the next generation to think about this substance use disorder. You're preferentially routing them into treating this substance use disorder. You're preferentially routing research funds and addiction resources for this substance use disorder. So what does it mean for the other ones that are continuing to go on? So child trauma. So Judith Herman was at Cambridge Health Alliance. I actually had the chance to train under her when I was there. And it was one of those things where I didn't even know about her and her work when I decided to go there, but it certainly laid the foundation for my career in many, many ways. But in her book, Trauma and Recovery, she says the developing child's positive sense of self depends on the caregiver's benign use of power when she's discussing complex trauma. And I would posit that when it comes to children, the caregiver isn't just the biological parents or the legal guardians, but it expands to society in a broader, more general sense when we think about how reliant children are on our various systems to provide them with what they need to develop in a healthy, appropriate way. So these are three people that I came across as a provider or as a forensic evaluator, and just some snapshots of that interaction. So one was an adult defendant in a capital murder case, and meaning he was looking at the death penalty. He wasn't someone who had pulled the trigger, but he was part of a group of people, and one of his co-defendants had. And so he said, I was proud to make it to 21, even though I was in prison. The second was a young man I saw in my private practice who said school was all I ever really had to worry about. He was a software programmer. And the third was a detained teenager. So when I treated kids who were in a juvenile justice facility, so essentially jail for kids, who said, they say I'm supposed to care about people when ain't nobody cared for me. So when we think about positive childhood experiences, the flip of the adverse childhood experiences, these are some of the basics, right? That somebody has a true home. That includes housing stability, food security, having their basic needs met, a reliable caregiver, consistent, available adult to instill a sense of self-worth and advocate for the child, because children have to have people advocate for them because of their place in society. Educational opportunity that includes safe schools, but also schools that prepare them for career or college and that have resources that they need, and access to a mental health care system that gives them adequate and appropriate care. So every single one of those elements is going to be undermined by the presence of child poverty, to the degree that the American Academy of Pediatrics actually identified child poverty as a major advocacy issue years ago, which is something our field still has yet to do. But in the United States, 15 million, or 1 out of 5 US children live in poverty. And for those of you who don't spend time looking at like what the poverty threshold is, I think it's helpful to point it out because I think it's lower than what we would think. So this is $26,200 for a family of 4. In the United States, if we're looking at low income families, not just those who are below that $26,200 threshold, 43% of US children live in those families. And while it disproportionately impacts minority children, white children are still the majority of children in poverty. So this is the case in a country that spent $732 billion on defense spending, which is more than the next 10 countries combined, where a majority of the US lawmakers are millionaires and 76.8% are men. And I do need to update that last percentage because I think that has changed a bit. But the point is, it's not as if we don't have resources that we can allocate. We're choosing to allocate those resources to certain places. And the people who are making those choices about where to allocate them aren't folks who have lived experience or who are unlikely to have lived experience or to have connection to this issue. And so with poverty, it can have a true home because it introduces housing and food instability. It also can make it so that the residents feels less safe. And there's 2 sides of this, right? So you can have neighborhoods that are heavily policed, where there's a lot of contact, but where there also isn't protection or buy-in from between the community and the police for various reasons. And so you can have heavily policed neighborhoods, but also ones that feel very unsafe and that are very unsafe. Impaired caregivers, some of the things that we talk about in my resident clinic, in our county clinic here in Atlanta, is that parents can't give their children what they themselves do not have. So often we're dealing with parents in that clinic who our residents can be frustrated by, but those adults often don't have much support themselves. They may be working a job where they don't have a living wage, and they have difficulty with accessing treatment and care. Unmet educational needs. So when we're thinking about that definition of mental health and being able to contribute to your society and fulfill your potential, that's really hard to do when you have under-resourced schools that essentially are going to serve to replicate the extant social hierarchies. And then limited access to mental health care and things like that. And so Miguel is the young man who told me that he was proud to make it to 21, even though he was in prison. So he was proud just to make it to 21 alive. And he was someone who'd been incarcerated from the age of 17 to 21. And the violation was of his probation after he was found in possession of a small amount of marijuana. And his original charge was something that was non-violent. And so he spent this very critical window of his life incarcerated because of these issues. But he's someone who, when we look at his story from the big picture, had a lot of things working against him. So he was in Florida, which is my home state. So I feel like I can talk about it honestly. It always lags at the very bottom in per capita mental health spending. And so in the larger society, you had low mental health spending, some notoriously low child protective services staffing, and a very punitive stance toward adolescence that you saw in the state around that time, but also as part of the broader societal narrative about you do adult crime, you get adult time. He had been placed in foster care with 12 different placements, and rather than him being provided with the educational and mental health resources he needed in order to keep placement disruptions from happening, he just kept getting shuffled place to place. Before he was in the custody of the state, he experienced neighborhood violence, housing and food instability, and victimization by his peers and by his brother, and a significant amount of family dysfunction that was intergenerational, with his father incarcerated, his mother who had abandoned him, had her own untreated sexual trauma and substance use disorder, and had been abused by his family as well. So there are ways that society's ideas about who is salvageable, who we should invest in, what we should invest in, shaped his experiences as he was going through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. And what we see, if we look at a list of things that increase people's risks of being involved with the juvenile justice system or being involved with the criminal justice system, those unmet needs mirror those same risk factors, and that's not a coincidence. And so poverty, community instability, community crime, availability of firearms, people who have a history of victimization, maltreatment, family violence, problem behavior because there's an absence of that sense of love and belonging and esteem, a negative attitude towards school, an idea that if they're going to live to be 21, which he wasn't convinced he would, that school wouldn't necessarily help him with that, and a foreshortened sense of future that makes investing in building for a future much less likely to happen. And all of these things set the stage for overrepresentation for youth with mental illness in the justice system. So again, in thinking about how we have set things up, this has been the case for years, that most of the children who are in the justice system have mental health problems, 70% with mental illness, 30% of serious mental illness with things like bipolar. And one of the things that I see as a provider, but also as a forensic consultant who ends up looking backwards in a lot of cases where people who are now adults but have had contact with the system throughout their childhood and adolescence, is there are ways that we don't count certain traumas, that we don't count it by design, sort of based on our diagnostic criteria, and that we don't count it as clinicians and as providers because of how we view certain people from certain communities. There have been many cases, the vast majority, it is the exception, where I have looked back at child mental health treatment records, at juvenile justice records, at court evaluated records of kids who have experienced seeing loved ones killed in front of them, who have lived in communities where this was a part of their day-to-day life, who have experienced sexual traumas, who have been shot. And this doesn't make it into the formulation of this person's issues or of their thoughts or feelings or behaviors. It doesn't make it into their diagnosis. It doesn't make it into how this mental health clinician is talking about them or thinking about them. And that has implications for how the court sees them and how they move through this system. And so there's a way that I have seen how our field is a bystander to traumas of certain kinds of kids and certain kinds of traumas because they are ones that are not as familiar to us perhaps, or things that we are not primed to think about given our widely used instruments and diagnostic criteria. So things like structural racism and community violence and exposure to neighborhood violence are things that we're not necessarily taught to ask about, even though they're very impactful for people. And so in doing that, there's a way that our diagnoses and that our treatment and our interventions perpetuates these inequities. So if you have a judge who just sees conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder and doesn't see any mention of that trauma, even though it's quite relevant, they want to look at that person very differently. And for people who don't have means, for people who don't have stable advocates, it is very easy for system involvement to snowball, and for an arrest to lead to detention, to lead to disruption of community attachments, to lead to educational trajectories being thrown off. And so when we're not careful and intentional about thinking about these broader, very significant traumas, we are part of the problem. And so this leads us into the criminal justice system. And I put that in quotation marks because a lot of the people who are incarcerated are not there necessarily because they've even been convicted of a crime. Many people are held in jails who haven't been convicted of anything and just can't afford bail. And then justice, I question because it is a system that is demonstrably unjust, and there are people within the system who will tell you the same thing. So this is a still from a clip. You never know how videos are going to play, so I just sort of talk you through what it's going to, or what happened. But this was a young Black boy who was playing basketball. And this is his driveway. This is his home. He's a kid playing at home. And he sees this police car coming down the street, and he picks up his ball and he stops playing and he hides behind the car. And he stays there until the police officer gets out of the camera shot, and then he starts playing basketball again. His father picked this up on the family's home security camera and asked him why he did it. And his response was, because they killed George Floyd. And I use this because when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about criminal justice, when we're talking about communities that have disproportionately borne the brunt of policing policies, this is something that is a nearly inescapable experience. He is at home playing as a child, and this is something that breaks up his day. And for many of your patients, this is part of their lived experience, and it happens in any number of ways, but this is just one illustration of how your life can constantly be interrupted by reminders of the vulnerability of people who look like you. The criminal justice system, and also the other piece of that is what that means for that child's relationship, like with the system, expectations of the system, and how that looks for him. So I have a 4-year-old nephew, and my sister has already started talking to him about how, there are nice police and there are police who aren't nice. And you have to be respectful, but you also can't trust them because of the realities of living in this society. So the criminal justice system, you don't have to take my word for it. It is a system that struggles with racism. And most judges acknowledge the system is racist, and most judges are white men. So this isn't just coming from, social justice warrior, Black female. This is coming from people in the system who in some ways have benefited from privilege. And what we see is that even when you control for prior offenses, that sentencing outcomes, so you're convicted of the same thing, but what consequence you get is different by race. And not only is it different by race, it's also different by shade. So if you are Black and dark-skinned, your outcome will be worse than if you are Black and light-skinned, and those will be worse than if you are white. And of course, this all works together there's an interplay with other systems. So there's been a lot of discussion about the school to prison pipeline. And again, this is something where there can be some skepticism about what that means or if that's a real thing. And so I'll give you an example. So the outgoing Secretary of Education had this, much publicized interview on CBS where she was talking about school policies and how she had been instrumental in shaping policies in Michigan. And she didn't really have, experience as a teacher or anything like that before she became the person who was setting policy for the country as it relates to education. And some of the things that she pushed for in Michigan resulted in a boom of charter schools. And with that, what happens is the money follows the kid. So even if you have a facility that's built for 600 kids, if there are 200 kids there, you still have to maintain a facility built for 600 kids. And so children in these schools were dealing with an even greater pull on the limited resources that it had available to them. And they started cost cutting. So doing things like in Detroit, but only in the city of Detroit, you could have teachers who weren't actually certified to teach. So let's look at the outcomes. So in the major city of the state where this woman was instrumental in shaping educational policy before she became somewhat instrumental in shaping policy for the country, the high school graduation rate for Black males was 23%. So 3 out of 4 Black males were not graduating from this school system. That is a system issue. In this country, if you're a Black male who has not graduated from high school, you have a 60% chance of being incarcerated. So you are creating a population out of which the majority will be incarcerated at some times in their life. And so coming back to this definition of mental health and this definition of social justice. And the question is, how can every individual realize his or her own potential, work productively and fruitfully, and make a contribution to her or his community in a society that fails to assure equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, and chooses not to care for its least advantaged members? And I would posit that it can't. And that without justice, it will be hard for our communities and our populations to truly have peace. And so this brings us to advocacy. So this, your advocacy ain't like mine, is a homage to Beebe Moore Campbell. And I think it's always helpful to come back to, what we can do and what makes sense for us and how to start. About these issues, people say this just seems so big, it's overwhelming. What do you do with this, right? And my response is that advocacy can take many forms, and that there are different ways to go about it. And so these are just 4 examples. One of the things about these issues being so big is that wherever you are, there's something that you can do to address them. So in the top right corner is Dr. Joe Bona, and he was a mentor of mine here in Atlanta. And he was a medical administrator, first at Emory School of Medicine and then at DeKalb CSB, which is like our safety net mental health care provider. And he was someone who advocated at the state level around policies that made access to care, that allowed his community service board to provide care more consistently because they were getting paid at a rate that allowed for that sustainability. And he was also someone who made it a point to mentor and sponsor people. So Dr. Bona was a white man physician who was the son of a white man physician, but he put a lot into people with different backgrounds, including me. When he suddenly passed away this spring, it was another one of his mentees, another Black woman, who called and told me about it. And we cried together about losing him because of what he had meant to us. And I put his example up because of what he did at a state level and as a medical administrator, but also as a mentor and a sponsor, right? So there are ways that you can use your privilege, your position, to be intentional about mentoring and sponsoring people from underrepresented groups. In the bottom right is Trauma and Recovery, which is the book by Dr. Herman. And it is a representation of how scholarship can be a form of advocacy, that documenting, bearing witness, paying attention to the data and the stories that are often left out of our texts and our criteria is a form of advocacy as well. And between Dr. Herman and Dr. Ruth Shem, I have become completely convinced that this is something that is important, just like going down to the Capitol and things like that are. In the bottom center is Dr. Anel Prim, who was at the APA for years in their Office of Minority Affairs. And she's been a mentor since I was in medical school. But I put Dr. Prim here because she's an example of how working within institutions to provide these programs can be instrumental in pipeline and in the creation of those. I was recently, when we were at the AdPert meeting the last year, we were actually able to all meet in person. It was remarkable. There aren't many Black PDs in the country, but we ended up sort of hanging out, and all of us had been touched by Dr. Prim, every single one of us, which is a testament to her approach and her advocacy. And then in thinking about advocacy as it relates to training and to medical education. So at Morehouse School of Medicine with our Child Psychiatry Fellowship, in building the Child Fellowship, I didn't just want to tell them about structural inequity, I wanted to show it to them. So for instance, for their school rotation, ACG&Me just says you have to have a school rotation. But the way that we built it out, they rotate at a private Montessori school, an inner city charter school, and a state GNET school. And these schools are supposed to be for kids with special education, but are actually undergoing lawsuits because of segregation by race. So they get to see those inequities in person. And also one of their required readings for that GNET rotation is about that lawsuit. So some basic steps to advocacy. So getting back to that quotation by James Baldwin, that we have to address these knowledge gaps, right? So first is to develop a knowledge base. 2 is to recognize injustice in your role in addressing it. And 3 is to respond to injustice through an iterative, sustainable process. So talks are great, grand rounds are great, training is great. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. There has to be action that follows it, an action that you're measuring the outcomes of so that you know if it's actually accomplishing the goals that you have in mind. This is Raymond Santana. He was part of the Central Park 5, now called the Exonerated 5. He was falsely convicted at the age of 14, spent 7 years incarcerated, so the remainder of his adolescence into his early adulthood. After he was exonerated and released, and the system knew that he was not guilty, it took another 12 years for his civil suit to settle. But I had the chance to interview him on a panel, I guess about 1.5 years ago at this point. And, we talked about these big systems issues and the advocacy that he's tried to do since he's been released. And one of the things that he said is that we need all hands on deck. Getting to the fact that, we don't all have to run for office and actually write the laws ourselves, but because this system is so far reaching, there's something that all of us can do. And because this system is so far reaching, we need all of us to do something. So there's a quote by Arthur Ashe. It says, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Understanding that whenever there is progress, retrenchment will follow. And so as you start to make waves, as you start to move forward, there are going to be people who don't want to change things and that things as they are fine. And so what you'll see is that this progress and those who champion it are going to be challenged, neutralized, or undermined. So understand that that's part of the process and don't be surprised when it happens. And so with that, I leave you with a quotation by John Lewis, who when I moved to Atlanta and realized I was in his congressional district, I was absolutely thrilled. But he says, do not get lost in the sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Vinson, for a wonderful talk. I think that you have sort of given us many different gems and ideas to take away from today's talk. And as somebody who is championing progress and change within our department, I think every time we have one of these talks, I see the progress that we've made. And I also see that we have a long way to go. So I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and for actually sharing your expertise. And I too have been touched by Dr. Prim, so I was very excited when you mentioned that. So thank you so much. So I want to open it up for the rest of the department. If folks want to ask questions, I think Danae, are you gonna moderate the chat?
Yeah, I'll pay attention to the chat, and I will just point out too that Dr. Forrester and I have posted a few things. A link to Dr. Vinson and Dr. Shim's book is available at the top. There's also a link to the Wall Street Journal commentary that Dr. Vinson mentioned at the beginning. Dr. Adams posted The Political Determinants of Health, another book he recommends. The 1619 podcast is listed here. And then I will give Jamie Spitzer credit for reminding me to do it, but there's a Maryland House bill that is going to be decided in this legislative session around the reform of juvenile sentencing, in line with what Dr. Vinson talked about. So I put a link there to that. So that's a piece of activism everyone here, as you know, professionals in Maryland can take some action on. And then I'll turn it over and I'll keep an eye on questions in the chat. And thank you, Dr. Vinson. This was really great.
Dr. Vinson, thank you so much. This was awesome. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, so it may be kind of garbled. So I work in community psychiatry, right, with severe mental illness, and in Maryland anyway, often the only way to get people long-term care is through juvenile or through the justice system, right? So I currently have a patient who I'm maybe he'll steal something so that then he can get the care that he needs. And I wonder if you have thoughts about deinstitutionalization and how, I don't know, how that plays into the school system.
Sure. And that is, it's not unique to Maryland, right? So part of why I chose to work at a juvenile justice facility is because if I want to see underserved Black males, that's where they are. And here, that is, like you said, the best way for them to get services. And so we can work in those systems, but there's a lot that we can do in an interdisciplinary manner when it comes to this, right? So this is frustrating to us as providers. It's also really frustrating to judges. And when we're able to collaborate with them, I think we have the potential to sort of make things move. And so thinking about, advocacy we do for individuals to try to get them services, but also what it means to talk to a group of judges or a group of guardian ad litems about mental health issues. And my experience has been that, as mental health providers, we're so busy and we're in clinic doing all the time. When we show up and we're willing to engage with them, they want to hear from you. They value your perspective and what you have to say. And so if you are interested in doing continuing legal education talks or interacting with judges, I have found them to be very receptive. And I am, a Black woman who wears Ankara print, who is in a very conservative state, and people have still been receptive to me because I have useful information to them. So thinking about your role as an educator for people with those intersecting systems and looking for ways that you may be able to work together to address that. Because it frustrates them, that they have to have this kid in their courtroom because the mental health care system doesn't work too. And when you can introduce legislation that has a judge's name on it or a judge's support and the mental health professionals, people are able to listen to and hear that. And I can say that we've seen some of that start to happen here in Georgia. Recent highly publicized elections notwithstanding, we are a supermajority, very conservative state. But because of where things have gone with mental health care, we now have a lot of judges who are advocating for mental health care reform and helping us with that now. But I think it also speaks to sort of who we see as dangerous, right? That we think that these people need to be in the criminal justice system to get their care versus being able to be served in the community. But it becomes this. It becomes a perpetuating loop, right? So if you're a juvenile justice judge and you're looking at a child who would go back home to a home where they don't have appropriate supervision, where there's no child psychiatrist, where they can't get access to treatment, and you're looking at a kid in a middle-class family who says we can pay out of pocket and get them to see somebody Wednesday, even if the judge isn't trying to be racially or socioeconomically inequitable, their choice is going to be dictated by what's available in those communities. And so there are ways that the gaps in our system and the choices that our systems make about what they make available feed into inequities and injustice too.
Thank you.
I'll read a question from the
That's a
chat.
great presentation, Dr. Vinson.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed that. The thing, well, first of all, if there's any way of us talking you into moving to Baltimore, it would be great. Just throw that out there. What I found interesting is that Maryland right now is the #1 state for the incarceration of young Black men between the ages of 16 and 34. #1 out of all 50 states. And so it's a prevalent problem here. And what I find interesting is the recent events at the Capitol building, where we had an insurgency, where people walked into our Capitol building and actually walked out and went home. And it kind of highlights the degree of the racial bias that occurs in this country and the impact it's having on people. And the fact that it exists. I think it, while it was a horrible thing to happen, it kind of brought light to what we're really facing, the reality of what we're facing. Even though people acknowledge the existence of that, it still was not brought to the forefront until that event, where we now they're looking at the idea of fighting the white supremacy in the country and bringing that to task. I think it's a multi-level problem, as you kind of demonstrated, that it infiltrates multiple systems. And so when we enter and attempt to impact that kind of disparity and injustice, it makes it honest to decide where you're going to enter and where you're going to put your time to impact the system, and how much we talk about outcomes-driven type of work. What's going to lead to an outcome that's going to be most advantageous. And in your experience, where do you think the impact has been the greatest that you've had, in terms of the level of system that you entered, with the judges, with the individual community groups, or with the prisons themselves? Where do you think you found the most outcome for your input?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And as someone with a private practice and in a public sector clinic, right, my Tuesday to my Monday, I see how the same behavior by teenagers is criminalized is the same behavior is criminalized differently, right? That my kids in the private practice take a benzo to school and maybe get suspended. The kids I saw at juvie steal some Skittles and get arrested, right? Like, so I see those disparities on a week to week basis, and but I think there are ways that people for whom the system has worked aren't as aware of that, right? And so events like what happened 2 weeks ago put that in the forefront in a way that it wouldn't naturally be in the forefront from their in their day-to-day life. But as people who are taking care of folks from these marginalized communities, that's part of learning to do the work. So thank you for just pointing out that sort of some of the lessons of how that went and how it was handled. The other thing that I thought was interesting about that is it shows the dangerousness of what I think is the real reverse racism, which is an overly positive view of whiteness and not appreciating when there's dangerousness that can be associated with people you don't expect it from, right? And that is not good for any of us in this society. But in terms of like, where to make the biggest impact or how, or where I think sort of mine has been, I honestly don't know. I have really high hopes for this fellowship because, by nature, it's something that gets to build like the next generation. And I've had the chance to do it from scratch. But there's a very good possibility that when I was talking about judges, that was in part informed by, I've been appointed to a mental health commission by the governor. Now, mind you, it has more judges and cops than mental health providers. But I do think we're going to be able to make some changes there that will affect care on a statewide level. But, I really think that advocacy is a very personalized thing. So I don't want people to think, this is the way that you go and you make a difference. I would encourage people to look at sort of what they already do in their day-to-day life, what privilege or position they have in their current position, and think about how they can leverage or use that to advance equity. So it could be something as simple as I am a faculty member and I am going to make sure I include an underrepresented minority on every abstract that I submit to a conference, right? Because all of us have affinity bias where it's easier for us to collaborate with people who relate to, who look like us, who have backgrounds similar to ours. Overcoming that when we're thinking about things that can advance people's career. Like that is something that anybody can do, right? And so looking at sort of where you are and what makes sense. And for me, it really is an organizing principle for everything I do, just because of, I think, my background and the things my families have been through. But, my private practice, I treat professionals who are underrepresented minorities. So it's a private practice, but I'm still meeting a need there. I was very intentional about teaching at HBCU med school. My whole shtick in the forensics world is that I'm not letting people get away with not acknowledging structural trauma anymore. And if the other expert does it, I'm going to tell them how to cross-examine them to make them look bad for not thinking about it, right? So like my goal is to try to change the standard in forensic psychiatry around addressing trauma and race and equity. And so I don't know, like ask me that question in like 10 years around where I think the impact is the biggest. But I think it's one of those things where, I could not do what Anel Prim did at APA for all those years. There's no way I could work at APA for all those years. But she was perfect and she did it with this amazing grace and she pulled it off, right? And so you have to know sort of who you are and where you fit. And I think by following that, you can be effective in your own way.
Thank you for that response.
We have a couple questions in the chat, so I'll read those, and then other people, if you want to put questions in the chat or just speak up, either is fine. So from Wanda Benz, and Ms. Benz, I might actually ask you if you want to come on and add a little context to your question, but she's asking, as an African-American provider, how do you cope with the disparities in treatment for African Americans?
So I try to make up what I can, right? Like I said, my private practice, and this year I literally like only take Black people because I only have so many hours there. So I reserve those hours for Black clients who want a Black provider. But I also am intentional about sort of mentoring and sponsoring people in the pipeline, right? So if anybody asks me to do a talk that is that has multiple people or to write something, I almost always have an underrepresented minority MIT or ECP on it. And I will sometimes tell them that's a requirement of me doing it. The other thing that I always make a plug for, if you look at social justice work and burnout, right? You can see where those two are connected. That is associated with a higher risk for burnout, and it's no wonder, right? Because you're like literally flailing against like these huge, powerful systems, and so part of that work is self-care. So going to sleep, getting exercise, FaceTiming with your 2-year-old niece, like whatever that looks like for you, and seeing that not as a dereliction of your duty or a distraction from your duty, but seeing it as an integral part of doing this in a sustainable way. So for me, given my background, a lot of the stuff I see at community clinics hits very close to home. I knew that I could not do full-time practice in a community mental health clinic in a sustainable way as my career. I couldn't. That would not work for me. And so I very intentionally constructed a career that had a mix of things where I still had these elements, but where it was constructed sustainably. And so I say that is part of your work as well, is realizing what a limited resource you are and protecting that resource.
Thank you. Another question we have is from Esther Glazer. I've been in front of multiple judges whose explicit responses to my forensic evaluations come down to, this is awful, but some of the most terrible, but he or she did the crime. The sentences ignore the facts and their impacts, especially their all-encompassing childhood traumas, which is against regulations. How might you respond?
Yeah, so I mean, this is, to use a biblical example, right? Sometimes the seed's gonna fall and take root, sometimes not. And so there are some judges who aren't workable. But the other thing I would say is, to the extent you're able to work with systems, so if you're doing some sort of like competency restoration or community reentry program or things like that, if you're able to work with DAs have a lot of power. They make a lot of decisions about who's charged with what, who even ends up going to court. So understand that even though like the judge is the one in the fancy role, like sitting above everybody, like they're not the be all end all. And if you're in a community or an environment where the DA is workable, that may be a route to go. Because if they're not charged with, felony obstruction of a police officer because they were paranoid and got into the tussle with the guy outside of Kroger, then, they won't end up in front of that judge. So that's one thing I would say, but there are some times it's not going to work. But I think it's still up to us to keep documenting and raising the issue, because sometimes it will, and hopefully eventually things will start to shift. Don't forget your DAs.
Can I say something? Good afternoon, everybody. So I think in thinking about the question that was just asked, what comes to my mind is that it's a fine line between like the legal system and how judges perceive the crime and somewhat overlook the mental health aspect, because like at 18 years old, a kid or a young adult could commit a crime, but we know that their brain is not fully developed. And when we think about the ACEs, and it talks about, adverse childhood experiences and the different levels of trauma and how they manifest in children and young adults, inwardly, or like you might see some anxiety, depression, or suicidal ideations, or you might see more behaviors like aggression and substance use and entry into the criminal justice system. So that's like my issue when it comes to all the institutions that you were kind of talking about. But I was just specifically talking about the, the criminal institution, and how, in terms of sentencing, you may have these lengthy sentences, but then we know that this person, their brain is not fully developed, or they've been exposed to so much trauma, and their mental health needs have not been met fully, and then I was thinking about like the educational system and children that, are impacted in school. I don't know. This is so good. It just really just gets in my bones, because I just really feel like this is a really good topic. Because I don't know. I didn't even really have a question. I was just thinking. My mind was just going all over the place. So I don't even know. I wrote down so much stuff. You guys have no idea. Like, my whole pen is full, because I just think this is it's a real interesting topic. And forgive me. I'm all over.
No, it's a lot. It's a whole lot, and sometimes it is. Change takes time, right? So sometimes we have to redefine what a win looks like, right? It might be that we get the charge dropped from armed robbery to robbery. And armed robbery comes with a 20-year mandatory for this 17-year-old kid, because in Georgia we start charging them as adults at 17. Whereas robbery may not, right? And so we may not be able to avoid it, but we try to get things change. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot, and it can be and feel overwhelming, but there's a way that being aware of this helps you understand your patients, right? So for the clinic, for the high school, my county clinic is zone 2. Their graduation rate is the same graduation rate as my private practice clinic. The clinic is zone 2, and the family income gap is like $180,000 between those two neighborhoods, okay? So the high school graduation rate is the same. The college readiness rate is 50% different. So when the kids at my county clinic say, my school isn't teaching me anything or preparing me to go to college, that's not the kid being negative or depressed. They're telling me the truth. And so me knowing that about that school system is important, so that I don't respond to them in a way that isn't, validating or understanding of how they feel about school.
We have a couple other questions in the chat. Thank you for that. I think it really is so important to understand like the systems that we're working in, and that's not always clear. And it does take like us as providers, as a way of advocating for our patients, just to know, where they're living and going to school and working and that kind of stuff. But going back to the chat, we've got, considering the limited resources, is there a quote schedule to address health inequities? Meaning, from a real world perspective, the current resources allocated are limited, plus different communities have specific needs, like Latin, Hispanics, rural, how to prioritize? Yeah,
so I think one of the approaches is looking at what you have that may not be maximized, right? So if you have primary care doctors in rural communities and no mental health providers, thinking about how we support integrated care, right? Because that's the workforce who's there. The other thing is, sometimes there are resources, we're just not systematically connecting people to them, right? So as part of our intake for our child psych clinic at the county clinic, standard questions are about housing insecurity and food insecurity and things like that, because we work and have relationships with for-profits that we can connect them to. But if we don't routinely ask about it, we're not gonna know, we're not gonna connect them. But of course, if they're hungry, or they don't know where they're going to live, it's going to make it really hard to treat their mental health issues. Or maybe that's creating their mental health issues, right? So we routinely ask about it, and we don't just ask about it and document it, we ask about it and have a plan for what to do if they flag that as a problem. And so sometimes it's not a matter of having to create the resource, it's a matter of making sure that you're aware of what they are and having a system to know when somebody needs help with that. And it's one of those things where, you may think, well, why can't they just call, or why wouldn't they just think of it? If you're struggling to survive, like that is something that people do or that they're aware of. And so that can be really helpful to do. And, I think the other piece of it is whenever you're able to get in front of decision makers, understanding they may or may not listen, it may or may not work the first time, the 12th time, or the 20th time, you draw those lines for them. You would be surprised how many people I ended up talking to about COVID and kids' mental health, whether this was like mental health folks or like lay popular media. They're like, what do we do about COVID and kids' mental health? I'm like, let's make sure they have food first, because they're missing their meals from school and a lot of their parents have lost their jobs. So I really don't want to care about like your mental health awareness campaigns in school. Like, they need to eat, right? Like, that is mental health policy, right? So helping people understand these connections, because they don't expect that to come from you. And when it comes from you, it can, I think, be really powerful.
Thank you. There was another question about one of the things you mentioned in the talk about Southern politicians blocking universal health care, and asking if there's a resource or article for that they wanted to look more into. I don't know if that's something you could share now.
Yes. Yeah, so that 1619 Project episode 4 goes through that.
Okay, 1619 Project episode 4. And I believe earlier in the chat, Dr. Forster linked the 1619 Project, so you'd be able to find that there. And then we have another question that just came in. Since there's a lack of African-American providers for the population that needs services, what do you recommend non-African-American providers do to best serve their patients and have the best treatment outcomes? I come across a lot of clients who only want to see African-American providers, but there are few within our programs.
Sure. And that is a very real issue. So one of the things that I would say is recognize that when you say, I don't see race, I treat everybody equally, that is in and of itself a microaggression, because it's denying the fact that their experience is different than your lived experience because of the color of their skin. So in recognizing that, doing what you can to be educated. And by that, I don't mean that you call Curtis to tell you about Black people, but that you do some research and some reading on your own, and don't put the burden of spoon feeding information to you, to your my colleagues of color, and are thoughtful about questions that you have for them and that you engage with them around. And also understanding and knowing about the community. So that data I have about, college preparedness, that's publicly available information, right? Like, you can look up and find out about homicide rates, burglary rates, incarceration rates, college readiness, high school graduation rates for people from the communities that you're serving. So there's things that you can do to help you understand their context, even if you don't understand everything. And the other thing I would say is, when it comes to their experiences because of race, being mindful of the fact that we all shy away from things we're not comfortable with, right? And that there may be ways that you don't want to sit there, or you may find yourself wanting to minimize it because it makes you uncomfortable. But the fact that you can stay away from this uncomfortable topic is in and of itself an example of your privilege, and a privilege that your patients don't have. So this isn't some like ancillary part of your work or extra thing you can do if you want to be like a really good provider. Like, it's a core central part of your work.
I think that's everything we have that's come through in the chat.
There's one, one really good movie on the prison system, the 13th. You may have seen it.
Yeah, I make forensic medical students watch that as part of their elective. That and Push Out.
And it gives you a very good, it's a very well done film, and shows you exactly what's happening in the prison system, how it's been developed over the years. And then one thing you were talking about with how do you approach the Black community as a non-Black provider. You have to, I think the tendency is to put everyone in one basket and say, I'm approaching a Black patient. You're approaching one of us. And when you're doing that, you have to realize that people come from all different diverse backgrounds, and there's a stereotypical view of who your client is. And if you enter with that perception that they are, you know, a young Black man who's, you know, and obviously he must have, you know, come from like a broken home or had problems and this and that type of thing, then you're way off base, because you have to look at the person as an individual and find out who they are and what their experience has been and what their perspectives are, you know, and not fall into the trap of thinking you're treating a young Black client or older Black client, you know, who may have an entirely different perspective or experience, and will take offense to your approach.
Yeah, and that's why I went back to neighborhood and learning about communities, right? So when people ask me to talk about like Black kids and ADHD, like I start with saying a Black kid in inner city Chicago has a very different experience than a Black kid in the Mississippi Delta, and that has a very different experience than a Black kid in a majority Black professional suburb of Atlanta, right? They're all Black kids, but their experiences in life are drastically different. So that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for this discussion.
We are a little over time. I don't want to keep you longer. We did have one question. Would you be willing to answer one more?
Sure.
Okay. So how can we help people of color open up to conversations on these issues?
So one of the things that that patients end up talking to me about all the time is how they look for signs that people are safe, right? So they look for in ways that you may not know to see if you're able to handle like them being you know, honest about their experiences. So I would say that background understanding and knowledge, and also being aware of your own biases and trying to overcorrect for them maybe like could be a good start, but understand like it's really going to be a lot more what you do than what you say.
Thank you so much for your time today. And this was really incredible. And we don't always go over time, so everyone really wanted to chat more with you.
All right, y'all have a good rest of your day.
Thanks a bunch, Sarah. Thanks a bunch.